Continuing Part 8, The Resurrection of Jesus and Subsequent Events. He was abroad at daylight. They represent him as having had frequent intercourse with them for 40 days. He communicated with them, in which he gives them no intimation of the hour of his resurrection. It was between Friday's sunset and Sunday's sunrise. When he rose, he did not show himself to the guard. The first fright they had was from the angel. He did not show himself to anyone until after the women had visited the sepulchre, which is indicative of the whole menstruation myth sort of thing, the 2 or 3 day new moon and going into the huts and all that. But he could have been just woke up not too long later and stayed in there for a day. There is almost no twilight in Palestine. Well, the twilight averages an hour and a half. And being closer to the equator, there's not this 2-hour twilight you get up in Canada, or this half-hour twilight you get up in Canada, or something like that. Or where it is dark. Well, it depends on where in Canada, but you know what I mean. There isn't that swing. It is dark. A glimmer comes in the eastern skies, and then the sun bounds forth. It was yet dark as the women came near enough to the sepulchre to see that the stone was gone from its mouth. A terrible suspicion flashed on the mind of the devoted Mary of Magdala that the beloved body had been stolen by the malignant enemies of Jesus, and she could not conjecture what outrages might have been committed on it. Well, it's just the body, he's not there, but yeah. In her grief and indignation, she rushed back to communicate the horrible news to John, with whom Peter then happened to be. The other women, Mary, Salome, and Joanna, is it Ioanna, or how are you supposed to say that, entered. They do not seem to have noticed the angel until they ascertained the absence of Jesus. They were sorely perplexed. Perhaps they had gone into an inner chamber of the tomb and returned after finding that the corpse was missing, when the angel revealed himself to them. Luke says there were 2 angels, or rather 2 men in long shining garments. The women were afraid. They bowed their heads. The angels said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that ye seek Jesus who was crucified. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen, as he said. Come and see the place where they laid him." He showed them the spot and the grave clothes lying in order, and then said, "Remember how he spoke to you when he was yet in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again." The women then distinctly recalled that prediction. The angel added, "Go your way quickly, and tell his disciples, even Peter, that he is risen from the dead, and goes before you into Galilee. There you shall see him, as he said to you." The women started off towards the city, full of mingled fear and joy. They seemed to have missed another party, now approaching the sepulchre. When Mary of Magdala had reached the city, she flew to the house of John, with whom Peter was, and rushing in breathlessly, exclaimed, "They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him." This was startling news. Both men rose and went out to the sepulchre. Peter had not yet learned that a special message had been sent to him. He had behaved so basely that he did not feel as if he were of the number of the disciples. But he had repented, and he loved the brotherhood of the disciples, and he loved his dead master, and he would gladly make amends for his denials by devotion to the corpse of Jesus. Still, the burden of the bad memory was on him. He did not go as fleetly as John. Both ran, but John reached the sepulchre first. There is a reverent awe checked him. There a reverent awe checked him. He kneeled down and looked into the grave clothes. Peter followed and went right in. There lay the shroud, wrapped up, and the napkin, which perhaps Mary of Magdala had wound about his mangled head. Everything was orderly. He had been taken away by neither friends nor foes. The former would have had no care for the clothes, or have not removed them. The latter would have torn them away carelessly. It looked as if Jesus had risen and carefully folded and laid away the garments of the grave, wherewith the hands of respect and love had wrapped him. Well, you can carry off a corpse without, losing the grave clothes or the shroud or whatever. Peter induced John to follow him. Peter was puzzled. In John there began to spring up some faith. He saw and believed, for as yet, according to John's own testimony, they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Then they left the sepulchre and went home. But Mary of Magdala stood without at the sepulchre weeping. The men might go, but she lingered about the spot where she had last seen the body of him whom she loved with all her heart and soul. She was alone. Hers was an absorbing love and an absorbing grief. She gazed through her tears down into the sepulchre where the dear Jesus had been laid. She was flooded with sorrow. She saw the two angels in white, but she had no attention to give to even angels. Nothing in heaven or earth could interest her but Jesus. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She could not be astonished or frightened even by so brilliant an apparition as two angels, but she was ready to burst forth when the subject of her love was touched. She sobbed out, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him." What marvelous beauty of loving is here, my Lord. It was the emphasis of appropriating affection. So she wasn't calling him a god. She was here. He was hers more than he was any others. Because, it seems that Jesus was married. She loved him more than any of the other women, or any man loved him. And he had done everything for her. She did not ask the angels for any consolation. She was inconsolable. She turned to go, and through her tears she saw a man standing in the garden. She scarcely looked at him. One man filled her heart and brain and eyes, and he was dead, and his dear body was stolen. When the stranger asked her, "Why do you weep? Whom do you seek?" she thought it was the gardener, and that he must know all about it. Her reply was, "Sir, if you have borne him hence, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." What marvelous beauty of loving is here, him, as if everybody must know Mary's him, if it were not considered meet for his corpse to be in that garden because he had died as a malefactor, although she felt that the body, if laid down on God's throne, would sweeten all heaven. She would take it away to some place where, without interruption, he might sleep the sleep of death, and she might weep the tears of the dying. She had not turned to gaze full on the speaker. It was Jesus, and she did not know it. He said to her, "Mary." In his lifetime, it is probably that he had never called the other Marys, with the tone in which he was accustomed to pronounce her name, the poor dear friend whom he had brought out of the darkness of insanity with the marvelous light of his love. The syllables in the familiar tone thrilled her. She turned. She saw him. She knew it was Jesus. She sprang towards him, saying, Rabboni. It seems that she would have embraced him, but Jesus checked her. He said, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren, and say unto them that I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. So, see, God isn't the Father of Jesus in any sense different than God being our Father. So it's not something we take literally. But see, it's not the mother, it's not the sister. So any physical contact would have just not been allowed unless it was the wife. So obviously who we're talking about here. Jesus had a wife. Mary left him. Her love was obedient. The brilliant moment was past. She might not see him again, but he was alive. He was to meet the brethren in Galilee. He was not the Comforter. He had not yet come in that character, as he had promised his disciples, because he had not yet ascended to the Father. So, Mary of Magdala, lovingest of women, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 devils, and into whom 7 angels had come. Well, didn't we already go over that that's not necessarily what we could say, what happened? That one character is not the same as the other in the story, necessarily. Sad Mary, glad Mary, left her Lord and went about the errand on which he sent her. The interview was exceedingly brief. Before the other women could reach the city, Jesus was with them. He met them. He saluted them with, All hail! Combining the accounts given by Mark and Matthew, a very natural history seems to me to be this. The women had entered the sepulchre and seen where Jesus lay. Then they had the vision of the angels. Then they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed, and departed with fear and great joy, leaving the sepulchre in great agitation. They may have wandered off from the city, quite as naturally as towards it, but recalling the message of the angel to the disciples, their joy predominated. Their mental equipoise began to return. To make up the lost time, they began to run, and thus they met Jesus. They knew him at once. As soon as he saluted them, they fell at his feet, clasping them and rendering him homage. He permitted in them what he had forbidden in Mary of Magdala. Their worship and their feelings were quite different from those of the loving Mary. Jesus soothed them, saying, Be not afraid. Go tell the brethren that I go into Galilee, and there they shall see me. As the women went to bear this message to the disciples, some of the watch went to report to the Pharisees, and to consult for their own safety. The Sanhedrin assembled. The soldiers probably told the facts as they occurred. The council was driven to desperation. They had hoped that the money given Judas should end the matter. Now, there must be more bribery. They gave the soldiers large money, as our common version has it, sufficient silver pieces, as it is in the original. They instructed them what to say. It was this: His disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. They also pledged themselves to stand between them and Pilate if a report of the affair should reach the governor's ears. We can readily account for the mental and moral temper of the majority of the Sanhedrin. A course of crime had blunted their sensibilities. It was natural that they should offer money to the soldiers. It was natural that the soldiers should accept it. Their ease was this: having discharged their duty faithfully, they were in such circumstances that if tried by military court, they would be executed. Caesar would take no angel for an excuse. They had suffered the government seal to be violated. They had committed a military crime. If brought to trial, their doom was sealed. They would better make all out of their circumstances that could be made. They took the money and took the pledge of the priests and went off and awaited events. But there is no evidence that these soldiers ever told to a military tribunal what the Sanhedrin put into their mouths. They could not be worse men than the priests, and not such fools as to tell a lie that would convict them. It is quite probable that they repeated a stupid falsehood to some of the populace in the presence of some of the priests to make good their bargain. The priest would use it among the vulgar people, and thus the report would gain currency among the Jews, but the soldiers would not have said so if arrested. We slept. That was a crime for which death would be inflicted, according to the imperial law. They stole. How could men tell what was done, or who did it, while they were asleep? But it is quite easy to see why the soldiers did as they were taught. There was in that direction some possibility of escape, but none in any other. That the body of Jesus could not have been stolen by anyone, a very slight inspection of the facts must show. If stolen, it was by friends or foes, or by the Jewish authorities, or by the disciples. The former could not have taken it, for if they had, they would have made an exhibition of the corpse after 3 days, and thus secured a complete demolition of the claims of Jesus. The disciples could not have done so. The presence of the dead body would be a perpetual reminder of the death of their hopes. There would be no stimulus in that. They had no conceivable reason for stealing the body. If they had, they could not have accomplished it. They were too few to overpower the guard. If they had made the attack, someone would have been at least wounded and perhaps killed, and the uproar would have aroused the city. But this is not charged. It is unreasonable to suppose that all the guard were asleep at once, and that at that junction the disciples stole the body. That would have involved the breaking of the government seal on a night when the moon was at full and the city was crowded and the populace was excited. If that had occurred, the disciples would have been prosecuted. But they never were prosecuted. The testimony of the soldiers would then have been called into court, and that would have acquitted the disciples and covered the Sanhedrin with shame. Was it possible that these details were put in more to make the story? There were in the Sanhedrin a few who believed in Jesus, and to them such men as Joseph and Nicodemus, for instance. Not the same one who wrote the Didache, and not the same one, the Gospel of Nicodemus, and but somebody. It would make sense. Someone who someone was raised Christian in the next century, looking up to this saint that they were named after, writing something, and the early historians must have been indebted for a narrative of what had passed in the Sanhedrin, including their infamous and stupid proposition to the soldiers. When the women returned and made their report, the disciples did not believe, but what the women said seemed to them like crazy talk. That afternoon, 2 disciples left Jerusalem to walk to Emmaus, a village 7 miles distant. The name of one is preserved. It was Cleopas, but we know not who he was. They started probably about 3:30 after the evening sacrifice. They had heard the reports which seemed to have been circulated among the friends of Jesus, that the sepulchre was empty. As they walked, they conversed upon the subject nearest to all their hopes and fears and interests, the dead Jesus and what had happened in the 3 eventful days. They were perplexed. They reasoned. They were probably striving to reconcile the apparently conflicting facts, the claims of Jesus and his manifest power, with the ignominious death which he had suffered. Jesus drew near and walked with them, but they were absorbed that they did not notice him. He spoke to them respectfully in such a way as not to be offensive, even in a stranger. What are these words that ye exchange one with another as ye walk? Luke says that they stood with sorrowful countenances. They looked at Jesus, but did not recognize him. The same historian says, their eyes were holden, they should not know him. Mark says that Jesus appeared in another form unto them. It is to be noticed that some change must have passed in the appearance of his person. None of his friends recognized him immediately on first sight, but none failed to recognize him afterwards. Who can tell what the change was? It was his own body. They all saw, and some touched him. Was the grossness of the material body disappearing, and the fineness of the spiritual body coming forth? But we are to record only what are the facts in this case. Well, the fact of what the mythology itself states, right? When Jesus asked his question, the 2 disciples looked at him. And by mythology, I mean it has meaning and purpose. It's biblically, look at the word myth from the biblical usage. There was nothing in the appearance of this stranger to make him seem a suspicious person, to be avoided, and the tone and manner of his respectful inquiry commended him to the confidence which these simple-hearted men gave him. Cleopas replied, are you the only sojourner in Jerusalem who has not known these things that have come to pass there in these days? It was a polite reflection on his apparent ignorance. What things? Asked the stranger to draw him out. One of them answered, concerning Jesus the Nazarene, who was a man, a prophet, mighty in act and speech before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death, and have crucified him. And then running out into confidential lamentations to the attentive and sympathizing stranger, the speaker continued, but we hoped that it had been he who was about to redeem Israel. Yet for all these hopes, this is the 3rd day since these things were done. Besides, certain women of our company astounded us, who were early at the tomb, and not having found his body, they returned, saying that they had seen a vision of angels, who say that he is living, and certain of those with us went to the tomb and found it thus, according also as the women had said, but him they saw not. The stranger had completely won their confidence and tested the genuineness of their grief, their faith, their love, and their fears. They had even confessed themselves disciples of the prophet who had seemed to have failed, whose ignominious execution had blasted their hopes, but not their affection. They even admitted him to a knowledge of what was passing in the inner circle of the friends of the crucified Jesus. These simple-hearted peasants were the first confessors. Then Jesus replied, O thoughtless and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter his glory? So again, a glory other than his own. Well, the word Christ indicates that by itself, but they suppose their master to be the Christ of God. Again, that of God stuff, that al and yah ending words meant that the thing wasn't a divinity, but owned by God, willingly owned by God, surrendered unto God in this aspect. If so, the books held to be sacred writings by the Jewish people, pointed to such a course of affairs as had happened to Jesus. Then he began with Moses, and running through his writings and those of their prophets, he explained to these simple men that these very things which had shaken their confidence should be confirmatory of the faith of those who understood and believed the Holy Scriptures. We can never know what special passages Jesus quoted and expounded in this conversation, but it is not difficult now to see how the whole system of worship instituted under Moses can be made highly typical of what happened to Jesus. To the minds of those who believe in him, it was new light to these simple but thoughtful men, and they received it gladly. Upon reaching the house where they were to abide, Jesus was about to take his leave and pass on, but he had been so charming a talker, his glowing eloquence had so won the hearts of his two ingenuous listeners that they urged him to stay with them. He consented. When the meal was spread, Jesus assumed the host's place. As they reclined at the table, he took the bread and uttered the usual thanksgiving, which according to the Jewish ritual was obligatory, where three ate together. There was something in the tone, or there was some change coming over Jesus, which caused them to recognize their dear dead friend, or perhaps as he broke the bread, they saw his wounded hands. Their eyes were opened, says Luke. At that instant, Jesus became invisible to them. This can scarcely be regarded as the history of a subjective process on their part, that both should see the same man and hear the same words through a long discourse, and see him as they prepared the meal, and behold and hear him while uttering the thanksgiving, and both lose sight of him at once, and the whole be a mere subjective fancy of both minds, is not at all in accordance with the well-known laws of our intellectual constitution. His disappearance is not explained. Well, that actually would be an explanation, because particularly people in the same training, you can say, are more likely to have the same experience. And then they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us as he talked to us by the way and opened the Scriptures to us?" They were so excited at what had happened that they arose and returned to Jerusalem. It must have been night, but enough was happening to draw the little circle closer together when Cleopas and his companion reached the city. They found the 11 apostles together, and others of his disciples. As soon as they entered, someone said to them, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." And perhaps all the strange occurrences of the day, so far as they knew them, were related by the company to the two who had just come from Emmaus. We do not know when this appearance to Peter occurred. It was some time since morning, of course, but whether it was before or after the revelation of himself to the Emmaus disciples, we have no means of ascertaining. It might have been after. There was time enough. The company were evidently greatly excited by the appearance to Peter. In an earlier part of the day, he may have gone to the sepulchre, or he may have been wandering about the suburbs, or through the streets, very disconsolate and unhappy. None of the disciples had as much cause for sorrow as he. He had denied his Lord and broke into profanity. The last look which Jesus gave him must have haunted him, even as if his master had risen from the dead. Would he appear to him? He had fortified his place. Perhaps none of his brother apostles knew how basely he had acted, but Jesus did. Would he allow poor Simon to fall penitently at his feet? Nothing can be more beautiful or appropriate than these first appearances of Jesus. He first shows himself to the grief of love in Mary of Magdala. He next shows himself to the grief of perplexity in the two Emmaus disciples. Then he shows himself to the grief and penitence of Peter. It was all in the beautiful consistency with the character he had displayed through his whole career. After the assembly had informed Cleopas and his companion of what was known in Jerusalem. They in turn gave an account of their interview with Jesus in Emmaus and on the way thither, and especially told of how Jesus was made known to them in the breaking of bread. There was great incredulity in the company and much perplexity. They all believed that he was no longer in the sepulchre, but his appearance to Mary and the other women and Simon, who professed to have seen him, seemed to them like hallucination. The story told by the Emmaus disciples increased the perplexity of the company. Jesus was seen so often in such different places, so near the same time, and vanishing so strangely, it began to be frightful. It suggested spiritual appearances. They were mournfully disturbed. Well, could have suggested psychological things too. It was probably the first time they had been gathered together since the supper with Jesus on Thursday night. They were afraid of the ecclesiastical authorities, and so the doors were shut. Just when they were in most perplexity by all these narratives of preternatural things, Jesus suddenly appeared in their midst. Whether he opened the door or was admitted by the doorkeeper, who might have seen that it was Jesus, or whether it was accomplished in some way still unknown to our philosophy. Well, philosophy's method of thinking, it's not whether something's in the quotes or not, right? We can not say. Here is a simple historical statement. It shows that he was no longer in the grave, but was in bodily intercourse with the disciples. Well, he communicated with them, shook the hands, and that sort of stuff. It's nowadays we would use that word there. As he entered, he said, "Peace to you," was his usual salutation, but they were terrified and affrighted. Terrified and affrighted. They thought they saw a spirit, a phantasm, a ghost, something produced preternaturally. Their nerves were unstrung by the events of the day. They were so agitated that they did not notice his salutation. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do reasonings arise in your hearts?" He saw that they regarded him as some strange appearance merely. Sorry about the errors, but I make sure I go back and say the right words, right? He reproved them for not believing the men and women who had seen him and had reported his resurrection, thus preparing them for his coming into their midst. He exhibited the wounds which they knew he had received in crucifixion. "Behold my feet and my hands, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit has not flesh and bones as you see me have." Whether they touched him or not, we do not know. They might have done so, but they were so overjoyed. They were too glad to believe. They were full of wonder. The sight of Jesus was first terrible and then glorious. They were in a state of great mental agitation, described very naturally by these intelligent historians. They behaved just as people would behave who are not playing a part or posturing for effect. So, see, historian, not witness. Jesus said, very simply, "Have you anything to eat here?" Now, I know sometimes the words overlap, but not in this case. Have you anything to eat here? They gave him some broiled fish and some honeycomb. Again, a very symbolic element of the story that has some meaning, right? Because we're referring to the death thing here, and we're also referring to the emperor sort of thing too, to give it tarot cards. he took them and ate. The whole company beholding him, and while eating, he said to them, These are the words which I spoke to you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which are written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me. These are the parts into which they were accustomed to classify the canonical scriptures. He showed that they all pointed to his death and resurrection. He assisted them, opening their understanding, that they might know what the scriptures meant in passages which have been sealed to them. He concluded by adding, Thus it is written, that the Christ should suffer and rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance for the remission of sins should be proclaimed in his name among all the nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Remember, so that's a false prophecy if he wasn't even dead in 2 days, right? You are witnesses of these things, and behold, I send the promise of the Father upon you, but tarry in the city until you be endued with power from on high. He cleared up for them a point which is greatly dark to the Jewish mind, namely that the Christ, the Messiah of God, should be a sufferer. Well, Moses and various others went through difficulties, so that's not out of the question, the Jewish mind. Of course, I'm not a Jew, so, they had so thoroughly misread the scriptures. We need not be surprised at that when we see how traditional readings of the New Testament come to have such influence on men, that when one gives a natural and consistent interpretation, it often seems a shocking innovation. His command to remain in Jerusalem must be understood as making that their center and headquarters, as we soon see them ordered to Galilee for a season. Well, over 1,300 contradictions between the Bible and the Bible, and as many inconsistencies, logical errors, scientific errors, that sort of stuff in the Bible, then it's trying to reason that out and say you accept it. It's there's always going to be something you haven't heard. John records that Jesus again said, Peace unto you. As my Father has sent me, I also will send you. And that's what the prophets are supposed to do. Not just, well, you've heard me. It's like, no, you're supposed to pass on the message that I gave. And then he breathed on them and said, Receive the Holy Spirit. If you remit the sins of any, they shall be remitted to them. And if you retain the sins of any, they are retained. And, of course, the purpose of that passage is to change the concept of apostle, or not change it because what's new about Christianity, right? It's to put it now in the Christian context rather than the direct context that was previous in this, what the Christians call the Bible, earlier in the tonic side at the very least. The act of breathing seems symbolical. These men were from that time very different from the men they had been before. They were wiser, better, deeper, more holy men. The last words are not to be interpreted as conferring upon any corporate body of officials the authority to bind upon their fellow men the sins which they have been guilty, and to forgive authoritatively all whom they chose to forgive. The meaning of these words, which are here repeated, having been used before, we have discussed their significance on page 421 and 422. In addition, we may add that 1, the company addressed were not the 12 apostles because there were other persons present to whom the Holy Spirit was given, if given to any, and who received this authority quite as much as the apostles, of whom there were only 10 present. The place of Judas II not having been filled, and Thomas Didymus being absent. 2, moreover, there is not the slightest historical evidence that any of this company, whether disciples or apostles, ever separately or conjointly attempted to exercise what came long afterwards in churchly corruptions to be called absolution. This pretense of priestcraft rests altogether on a misrepresentation of this passage. And could the number have been 70? Or could it just have been the 10?